Short stories in prose and verse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Short stories in prose and verse by Henry Lawson. The Preface. This is an attempt to publish in Australia a collection of sketches and stories at a time when everything Australian, in the shape of a book, must bear the imprint of a London publishing firm before our critics will condescend to notice it, and before the reading public will think it worth its while to buy nearly so many copies as will pay for the mere cost of printing a presentable volume. The Australian writer, until he gets a London hearing, is only accepted as an imitator of some recognised English or American author, and so soon as he shows signs of coming to the front, he is labelled the Australian Savvy, the Australian Burns, or the Australian Bret Harte, and lately the Australian Kipling. Thus, no matter how original he may be, he is branded at the very start as a plagiarist, and by his own country, which thinks, no doubt, that it is paying him a compliment and encouraging him, while it is really doing him a cruel and an almost irreparable injury. But mark, so soon as the southern writer goes home and gets some recognition in England, he is so-and-so, the well-known Australian author whose work has attracted so much attention in London lately, and we first hear of him by cable, even though he might have been writing at his best for 10 years in Australia. The same paltry spirit tried to dispose of the greatest of modern short story writers as the Californian Dickens, but America wasn't built that way. Neither was Bret Harte. To illustrate the above growl, a Sydney daily paper reviewing the Bulletin's Golden Shanty when the first edition came out said of my story, His Father's Mate, that it stood out distinctly as an excellent specimen of that kind of writing which Bret Harte set the world imitating in vain, and, being full of local colour, it was no unworthy copy of the great master. That critic evidently hadn't studied the great master any more than he did my yarn of Australian goldfield life. Then he spoke of another story as also having the Californian flavour. For the other writers I can say that I feel sure that they could point out their scenery and name, or, in some cases, introduce the reader to their characters in the flesh. The first 17 years of my life were spent on the goldfields, and therefore I didn't need to go back, in imagination, to a time before I was born and to a country I had never seen for literary material. This pamphlet, I can scarcely call it a volume, contains some of my earliest efforts, and they are sufficiently crude and faulty. They have been collected and printed hurriedly, with an eye to Christmas, and without experienced editorial assistance, which last, I begin to think, was sadly necessary. However, we all hope to do better in future, and I shall have more confidence in my first volume of verse, which will probably be published sometime next year. The stories and sketches were originally written for the Bulletin, Worker, Truth, Antipodean Magazine, and the Brisbane Boomerang, which last was one of the many Australian publications which were starved to death because they tried to be original, to be honest, to pay for and encourage Australian literature, and, above all, to be Australian, while the high average intelligence of the Australians preferred to patronise thievish imported rags of the faked bits order. End of preface. Chapter 1 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Rats. Why, there's two of them, and they're having a fight. Come on. It seemed a strange place for a fight, that hot, lonely cotton bush plain, and yet not more than half a mile ahead there were apparently two men struggling together on the track. The three travellers postponed their smoko and hurried on. They were shearers, a little man and a big man, known respectively as Sunlight and Macquarie, and a tall, thin, young jackaroo whom they called Milky. "I wonder where the other man sprang from. I didn't see him before," said Sunlight. "He must have been laying down in the bushes," said Macquarie. "They're going at it proper too. Come on, hurry up and see the fun." They hurried on. "It's a funny looking fella, the other fella," panted Milky. "He don't seem to have no head. Look, he's down. They're both down. They must have clinched on the ground. No, they're up and at it again. Why, good Lord, I think the other's a woman." "My oath, so it is," yelled Sunlight. "Look, the brute's got her down again. He's kicking her. Come on, chaps, come on, or he'll do for her." They dropped swags, water bags and all, and raced forward, but presently Sunlight, who had the best eyes, slackened his pace and dropped behind. His mates glanced back at his face, saw a peculiar expression there, looked ahead again, and then dropped into a walk. They reached the scene of the trouble, and there stood a little withered old man by the track, with his arms folded close up under his chin. He was dressed mostly in calico patches, and half a dozen corks, suspended on bits of string from the brim of his hat, dangled before his bleared optics to scare away the flies. He was scowling malignantly at a stout dumpy swag which lay in the middle of the track. "Well, old rats, what's the trouble?" asked Sunlight. "Oh, nothing, nothing," answered the old man without looking round. "I fell out with my swag, that's all. He knocked me down, but I've settled him." "Oh, but look here," said Sunlight, winking at his mates. "We saw you jump on him when he was down. That ain't fair, you know." "But you didn't see it all," cried Rats, getting excited. "He hit me down first, and look here, I'll fight him again for nothing, and you can see fair play." They talked a while. Then Sunlight proposed to second the swag while his mate supported the old man, and after some persuasion Milky agreed, for the sake of the lark, to act as timekeeper and referee. Rats entered into the spirit of the thing. He stripped to the waist, and while he was getting ready the travellers pretended to bet on the result. Macquarie took his place behind the old man, and Sunlight upended the swag. Rats shaped and danced around. Then he rushed, feinted, ducked, retreated, darted in once more, and suddenly went down like a shot on the broad of his back. No actor could have done it better. He went down from that imaginary blow as if a cannon-ball had struck him in the forehead. Milky called time, and the old man came up looking shaky. However, he got in a tremendous blow which knocked the swag into the bushes. Several rounds followed with varying success. The men pretended to get more and more excited and betted freely, and Rats did his best. At last they got tired of the fun. Sunlight let the swag lie after Milky called time, and the jackaroo awarded the fight to Rats. They pretended to hand over the stakes, and then went back for their swags, while the old man put on his shirt. Then he calmed down, carried his swag to the side of the track, sat down on it, and talked rationally about bush matters for a while. But presently he grew silent, and began to feel his muscles and smile idiotically. "Can you lend us a bit of meat?" said he suddenly. They spared him half a pound, but he said he didn't want it all, and cut off about an ounce, which he laid on the end of his swag. Then he took the lid off his billy and produced a fishing line. He baited the hook, threw the line across the track, and waited for a bite. Soon he got deeply interested in the line, jerked it once or twice, and drew it in rapidly. The bait had been rubbed off in the grass. The old man regarded the hook disgustedly. "Look at that!" he cried. "I had him, only I was in such a hurry. I should have played him a little more." Next time he was more careful. He drew the line in warily, grabbed an imaginary fish, and laid it down on the grass. Sunlight and Co. were greatly interested by this time. "What you think of that?" asked Rats. "It weighs 30 pound if it weighs an ounce. What you think of that for a cod? Hook's halfway down his blessed gullet." He caught several cod and a bream while they were there, and invited them to camp and have tea with him. But they wished to reach a certain shed next day, so, after the ancient had borrowed about a pound of meat for bait, they went on and left him fishing contentedly. But first Sunlight went down into his pocket and came up with half a crown, which he gave to the old man, along with some tucker. "You'd best push on to the water before dark, old chap," he said kindly. When they turned their heads again, Rats was still fishing, but when they looked back for the last time before entering the timber, he was having another row with his swag, and Sunlight reckoned that the trouble arose out of some lies which the swag had been telling about the bigger fish it caught. And late that evening, a little withered old man, with no corks round his hat, and with a humorous twinkle instead of a wild glare in his eyes, called at a wayside shanty, had several drinks, and entertained the chaps with a yarn about the way in which he had 3 blanky fellas for some tucker and half a caser by pretending to be balmy. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, A Narrow Escape. I suppose the reader has experienced or heard of hair-breadth escapes, the memory of which has caused his own hair to stand on end. Yet when he has read the following untruthful story, he will be ready to exclaim in a tone of intense conviction that truth is indeed stranger than fiction. A few years ago I was travelling with a prospecting party in some place, and one morning I awoke and found my horse gone. Without disturbing my companions, I took a bridle and started to follow up the horse's tracks across the sand. The horse must have broken loose some time in the night, for I followed his tracks a good distance until they disappeared in a grass patch. I wandered about for some time in a vain endeavour to pick up the trail, and ended up by getting lost myself. The morning passed away, and I was still wandering hopefully when, about noon, I descried 3 dark figures on the horizon of the plain. I soon saw that they were blacks, and that they were coming in my direction. As they advanced nearer, I saw that one was armed with a nulla or club, whilst the other 2 carried spears which they brandished in an unpleasant manner. I knew there was not a moment to lose if I wished to save my life, which I did, so I started to run. It was an awful race. I felt my underclothing sticking to my body with the perspiration, and my braces and bootlaces gently giving out. I kept on under the broiling heat, with the blacks steadily gaining in the rear, until at last I felt that I could run no longer. My time was come. I fell on the glistening sand and prayed for a sudden and comparatively painless death. The blacks came up and surrounded me, and I saw in their looks that I could not expect mercy at their hands. The memories of my life went through my brain like a flash of lightning, or rather like flashes of lightning. The 2 blacks, who were armed with spears, raised their weapons to a horizontal position and aimed the points at my heart. They swayed the spears backward and forward several times to gain momentum. The suspense was very trying indeed. I drew a long breath and attempted to close my eyes, but just as they swung their spears back for a final and fatal thrust, the black fellow who carried the club, and who had up to this moment stood perfectly still and silent, suddenly raised his weapon and brought it down on my head with a sickening crash, and I fell at his feet, a ghastly corpse. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. We called him Ali for short. I don't believe in ghosts. I never did have any sympathy with them, being inclined to regard them as a nuisance and a bore. A ghost generally comes fooling around when you want to go to sleep, and his conversation, if he speaks at all, invariably turns on murders and suicides and other unpleasant things in which you are not interested and which only disturb your rest. It is no use locking the door against a ghost, for, as is well known, he can come in through the keyhole, and there are cases on record when a ghost has been known to penetrate a solid wall. You cannot kick a ghost out. He is impervious to abuse, and if you throw a boot at him, likely as not, it will go right through a new looking-glass worth 18 shillings. I remember about 5 years ago I was greatly annoyed by a ghost while doing a job of fencing in the bush between here and Perth. I was camping in an old house which had been used as a barrack for the convicts or their keepers, I'm not sure which, in the lively old days of the Broad Arrow. He was a common-looking ghost of a skeleton kind, and was arrayed in what appeared to be the tattered remnants of an old-time convict uniform. He still wore a pair of shadowy manacles, but being very elastic and unsubstantial, and stretching the full length of his stride, he did not seem to notice them at all. He had a kind of artful dodger expression about his bare jawbones, and in place of the ordinary halo of the ring variety, he wore a shining representation of a broad arrow which shed a radiance over his skull. He used to come round and wake me about midnight with a confounded rigmarole about a convict who was buried alive in his irons, and whose representative my unwelcome visitor claimed to be. I tried all I knew to discourage him. I told him I wasn't interested and wanted to go to sleep. But his perseverance wore me out at last, and I tried another tack. I listened to his confounded yarn from beginning to end, and sympathized with him, and told him that he, or the individual he represented, had been treated confoundedly badly, and I promised to make a poem about it. But even then he wasn't satisfied. Nothing would suit him, but he must spin his old yarn, and be sympathized with about 7 times a week, always choosing the most unbusinesslike hours, between 1 and 3 in the morning, for his disclosures. At last I could stand it no longer. I was getting thin and exhausted from want of sleep, so I determined on a course of action. I had a dog at home, a big black dog with unpleasant eyes and a chewing-up apparatus that an alligator might have envied. He had a most enterprising appetite, and wasn't afraid of anything on the surface of this earth or under it, as far as he could burrow. He would gnaw a log to pieces rather than let the possum it contained escape him. He was not the sort of dog to stand any nonsense, even from a ghost. His full name was Alligator Desolation. We called him Ali for short, and as I considered that if any person on earth could lay the ghost that annoyed me, that person was Alligator Desolation, I decided to bring him along. The next time I journeyed home for rations, I brought Alligator Desolation back with me. On the trip back he killed 5 kangaroos, 16 possums, 4 native rats, 2 native bears, 3 sheep, a cow and a calf, and another dog that happened by, and before he had been 2 hours at the hut, he had collected enough carcasses of indigenous animals to stink a troop out in a week, or, to feed all the dogs in Constantinople. I had tea and a smoke while Ali was resting, and about 11 o'clock I lay down in my bunk, dressed as I was, and waited. At about 1 I heard the usual unearthly noises which accompanied the arrival of my friend the ghost, and Ali went out to investigate. While the dog was gone, the ghost strolled in through the door of the end room, apparently unconscious of his danger. He glided straight up to the side of my bunk, took his accustomed seat on a gin case, and commenced in a doleful voice to pitch his confounded old yarn again, but he hadn't uttered half a dozen ghostly words when Alligator Desolation came in through the side door. The ghost caught sight of Ali before the latter saw him, and made for the window. Ali wasn't far behind. He made a grab at the ghost's nether garments, but they gave way easily, being of a ghostly material. Then Ali leapt out through the window and chased the ghost 3 times round the house, and then the latter came in through an opening in the wall where a slab had fallen out. Being of an easily compressible constitution, he came through, of course, with the facility peculiar to his kind, but the crack was narrow, and the dog stuck fast. His ghostship made the best of his opportunity, and approaching my bed, hurriedly endeavoured to continue his story as though his ghostly existence depended on it. But his utterances were drowned by the language of Alligator, whose canine oaths were simply terrific. At last, collecting all his energy for one mighty effort, Alligator came through, bringing down the slabs on each side of him. He made for the ghost at once, and the ghost made for the window. This time Alligator made a grab for the spectre's ankle, and his teeth came together with a crash that threatened their destruction. Ali must have been greatly astonished and disgusted, because he so seldom missed anything he reached for. But he wasn't the kind of dog to give up. He leapt through the window, and, after a race round the hut lasting some minutes, the ghost gave it up and made for the scrub. Seeing the retreat through a crack in the slabs, I immediately rose, went outside, and mounted my horse, which I had kept ready saddled in case of emergency. I followed the chase for about 5 miles, and at last reached a mound under some trees, which looked like an old grave. Down through this mound the ghost dived. Alligator Desolation immediately commenced to dig, and made 2 feet in no time. It appeared that a wombat had selected the grave as a suitable site for the opening of his burrow, and after having sunk about 3 feet, was resting from his labours. There was a short and angry interview between Alligator and the wombat, during which the latter expired, and then Ali continued his work of excavation. After sinking 2 feet deeper, he dragged out what appeared to be the leg bone of a human being, attached to which was a pair of heavy leg irons, such as were used in the old convict days. Ali went down the hole again, but presently he paused in his digging operations, and I heard a noise like a row in the infernal regions. Then a thin, shadowy form issued from the grave, and made off through the scrub with the dog in pursuit. My horse was knocked up, so I left the chase to Alligator, and returned home to await developments. Ali came back about 3 days later with his hair badly singed, and smelling strongly of brimstone. I have no doubt that he chased the ghost to the infernal regions, and perhaps had an interview with Cerberus at the gate, or the boss himself. But the dog's tail was well up, and a satisfied grin oozed from the roots of his every fang, and by the same tokens I concluded that the other party, whoever he was, had got fatally left. I haven't seen the ghost since. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, Bush Cats. Domestic cats, we mean the descendants of cats who came from the northern world during the last 100-odd years. We do not know the name of the vessel in which the first Thomas and his Maria came out to Australia, but we suppose that it was one of the ships of the First Fleet. Most likely Maria had kittens on the voyage, 2 lots perhaps, the majority of which were buried at sea, and no doubt the disembarkation caused her much maternal anxiety. The feline race has not altered much in Australia from a physical point of view, not yet. The rabbit has developed into something like a cross between a kangaroo and a possum, but the bush has not begun to develop the common cat. She is just as sedate and motherly as the mummy cats of Egypt were, but she takes longer strolls of nights, climbs gum trees instead of roofs, and hunts stranger vermin than ever came under the observation of her northern ancestors. Her views have widened. She is mostly thinner than the English farm cat, which is, they say, on account of eating lizards. English rats and English mice, we say English because everything which isn't Australian in Australia is English or British. English rats and English mice are rather rare or non-existent in the bush, but the hut cat has a wider range for game. She is always dragging in things which are unknown in the halls of zoology, ugly, loathsome, crawling abortions which have not been classified yet, and perhaps could not be. The Australian zoologist ought to rake up some more dead languages and then go out back with a few bush cats. The Australian bush cat has a nasty, unpleasant habit of dragging a long, wriggling, horrid black snake — she seems to prefer black snakes — into a room where there are ladies proudly laying it down in a conspicuous place, usually in front of the exit, and then looking up for approbation. She wonders, perhaps, why the visitors are in such a hurry to leave. Pussy doesn't approve of live snakes round the place, especially if she has kittens, and if she finds a snake in the vicinity of her progeny, well, it is bad for that particular serpent. This brings recollections of a neighbour's cat who went out in the scrub one midsummer day and found a brown snake. Her name, the cat's name, was Mary Ann. She got hold of the snake all right, just within an inch of its head, but it got the rest of its length wound around her body and squeezed about 8 lives out of her. She had the presence of mind to keep her hold, but it struck her that she was in a fix, and that if she wanted to save her 9th life, it wouldn't be a bad idea to go home for help. So she started home, snake and all. The family were at dinner when Mary Ann came in, and although she stood on an open part of the floor, no one noticed her for a while. She couldn't ask for help, for her mouth was too full of snake. By and by one of the girls glanced round, and then went over the table with a shriek and out the back door. The room was cleared very quickly. The eldest boy got a long-handled shovel, and in another second would have killed more cat than snake, but his father interfered. The father was a shearer, and Mary Ann was a favourite cat with him. He got a pair of shears from the shelf and deftly shore off the snake's head and one side of Mary Ann's whiskers. She didn't think it safe to let go yet. She kept her teeth in the neck until the selector snipped the rest of the snake off her. The bits were carried out on a shovel to die at sundown. Mary Ann had a good drink of milk, and then got her tongue out and licked herself back into the proper shape for a cat, after which she went out to look for that snake's mate. She found it, too, and dragged it home the same evening. Cats will kill rabbits and drag them home. We knew a fossicker whose cat used to bring him a bunny nearly every night. The fossicker had rabbits for breakfast until he got sick of them, and then he used to swap them with a butcher for meat. The cat was named Ingersoll, which indicates his sex and gives an inkling to his master's religious and political opinions. Ingersoll used to prospect round in the gloaming until he found some rabbit holes which showed encouraging indications. He would shepherd one hole for an hour or so every evening until he found it was a duffer, or worked it out. Then he would shift to another. One day he prospected a big hollow log with a lot of holes in it, and more going down underneath. The indications were very good, but Ingersoll had no luck. The game had too many ways of getting out and in. He found that he could not work that claim by himself, so he floated it into a company. He persuaded several cats from a neighbouring selection to take shares, and they watched the holes together, or in turns they worked shifts. The dividends more than realized even their wildest expectations, for each cat took home at least one rabbit every night for a week. A selector started a vegetable garden about the time when rabbits were beginning to get troublesome up country. The hare had not shown itself yet. The farmer kept quite a regiment of cats to protect his garden, and they protected it. He would shut the cats up all day with nothing to eat, and let them out about sundown. Then they would mooch off to the turnip patch like farm labourers going to work. They would drag the rabbits home to the back door and sit there and watch them until the farmer opened the door and served out the ration of milk. Then the cats would turn in. He nearly always found a semicircle of dead rabbits and watchful cats around the door in the morning. They sold the product of their labour direct to the farmer for milk. It didn't matter if one cat had been unlucky, had not got a rabbit. Each had an equal share in the general result. They were true socialists, those cats. One of those cats was a mighty big Tom named Jack. He was death on rabbits. He would work hard all night laying for them and dragging them home. Some weeks he would graft every night, and at other times every other night, but he was generally pretty regular. When he reckoned he had done an extra night's work, he would take the next night off and go 3 miles to the nearest neighbour's to see his Maria and take her out for a stroll. Well, one evening Jack went into the garden and chose a place where there was good cover and lay low. He was a bit earlier than usual, so he thought he would have a doze till rabbit time. By and by he heard a noise, and slowly, cautiously, opening one eye, he saw 2 big ears sticking out of the leaves in front of him. He judged that it was an extra big bunny, so he put some extra style into his manoeuvres. In about 5 minutes he made his spring. He must have thought, if cats think, that it was a whopping old man rabbit, for it was a pioneer hare. Not an ordinary English hare, but one of those great, coarse, lanky things which the bush is breeding. The selector was attracted by an unusual commotion and a cloud of dust among his cabbages, and came along with his gun in time to witness the fight. First, Jack would drag the hare, and then the hare would drag Jack. Sometimes they would be down together, and then Jack would use his hind claws with effect. Finally, he got his teeth in the right place and triumphed. Then he started to drag the corpse home, but he had to give it best and ask his master to lend a hand. The selector took up the hare, and Jack followed home, much to the family's surprise. He did not go back to work that night. He took a spell. He had a drink of milk, licked the dust off himself, washed it down with another drink, and sat in front of the fire and thought for a goodish while. Then he got up, walked over to the corner where the hare was lying, had a good look at it, came back to the fire, sat down again, and thought hard. He was still thinking when the family retired. Our own cat, dozing on the end of the table, had just woke up and favoured us with a decided, unmistakable wink. We'll close this article with that wink. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Johnson, Alias, Crow. Where the seasons are divided, and the bush begins to change, and the links are rather broken in the great dividing range, where the atmosphere is hazy underneath the summer sky, lies the little town of Eton, rather westward of Macquarie. Near the township, in the graveyard where the dead of Eton go, lies the body of a sinner known as Johnson, Alias, Crow. He was 64, was Johnson, and in other days, lang syne, was apprenticed to a shipwright in the land across the Rhine. But whatever were his prospects in the days of long ago, things went very bad with Johnson, Heinrich Johnson, Alias, Crow. He, at Eton, where he drifted in his age a stranded wreck, got £3 by false pretences in connection with a cheque. But he didn't long enjoy it. The police soon got to know, and the lock-up closed on Johnson, Lonely Johnson, Alias, Crow. Friday night, and Crow retired, feeling, as he said, unwell, and the warder heard the falling of a body in the cell. Going in, the warder saw him bent with pain and crouching low. Death had laid his hand on Johnson, Heinrich Johnson, Alias, Crow. Then the constable bent o'er him, asked him where he felt the pain. Johnson only said, "I'm dying," and he never spoke again. They had waited for a witness, and the local people say Johnson's trial would have ended on that very Saturday. But he took his case for judgment, where our cases all must go, and the higher court is trying Heinrich Johnson, Alias, Crow. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of short stories in prose and verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The Drover's Wife. The two-roomed house is built of round timber, slabs and stringy bark, and floored with split slabs. A big bark kitchen standing at one end is larger than the house itself, veranda included. Bush all round, bush with no horizon, for the country is flat, no ranges in the distance. The bush consists of stunted, rotten native apple trees, no undergrowth, nothing to relieve the eye save the darker green of a few she-oaks, which are sighing above the narrow, almost waterless creek 19 miles to the nearest sign of civilization, a shanty on the main road. The drover, an ex-squatter, is away with sheep. His wife and children are left here alone. 4 ragged, dried-up-looking children are playing about the house. Suddenly one of them yells, "Snake, mother! Here's a snake!" The gaunt, sun-brown bushwoman dashes from the kitchen, snatches her baby from the ground, holds it on her left hip, and reaches for a stick. "Where is it?" "Here, gone into the wood heap," yells the eldest boy, a sharp-faced urchin of 11. "Stop there, mother! I'll have him! Stand back! I'll have the beggar!" "Tommy, come here, or you'll be bit! Come here at once, when I tell you, you little wretch!" The youngster comes reluctantly, carrying a stick bigger than himself. Then he yells triumphantly, "There it goes, under the house!" and darts away with his club uplifted. At the same time, the big, black, yellow-eyed dog of all breeds, who has shown the wildest interest in the proceedings, breaks his chain and rushes after that snake. He is a moment late, however, and his nose reaches the crack in the slabs just as the end of its tail disappears. Almost at the same moment, the boy's club comes down and skins the aforesaid nose. Alligator takes small notice of this and proceeds to undermine the building, but he is subdued, after a struggle, and chained up. They cannot afford to lose him. The drover's wife makes the children stand together near the doghouse while she watches for the snake. She gets 2 small dishes of milk and sets them down near the wall to tempt it to come out. But an hour goes by, and it does not show itself. It is near sunset, and a thunderstorm is coming. The children must be brought inside. She will not take them into the house, for she knows the snake is there, and may at any moment come up through a crack in the rough slab floor. So she carries several armfuls of firewood into the kitchen and then takes the children there. The kitchen has no floor, or rather an earthen one called a ground floor in this part of the bush. There is a large roughly made table in the centre of the place. She brings the children in and makes them get on this table. They are 2 boys and 2 girls, mere babies. She gives them some supper, and then, before it gets dark, she goes into the house and snatches up some pillows and bedclothes, expecting to see or lay her hand on the snake any minute. She makes a bed on the kitchen table for the children and sits down beside it to watch all night. She has an eye on the corner and a green sapling club laid in readiness on the dresser by her side, also her sewing basket and a copy of the Young Lady's Journal. She has brought the dog into the room. Tommy turns in under protest, but says he'll lie awake all night and smash that blinded snake. His mother asks him how many times she has told him not to swear. He has his club with him under the bedclothes, and Jackie protests. "Mummy, Tommy's skinning me alive with his club. Make him take it out." Tommy: "Shut up, you little... Do you want to be bit with the snake?" Jackie shuts up. "If you're bit," says Tommy after a pause, "you'll swell up and smell and turn red and green and blue all over till you bust, won't he, mother?" "Now then, don't frighten the child. Go to sleep," she says. The 2 younger children go to sleep, and now and then Jackie complains of being skeezed. More room is made for him. Presently Tommy says, "Mother, listen to them adjective little possums. I'd like to screw their blanky necks." And Jackie protests drowsily, "But they don't hurt us, the little blanks." Mother: "There, I told you you'd teach Jackie to swear." But the remark makes her smile. Jackie goes to sleep. Presently Tommy asks, "Mother, do you think they'll ever extricate the adjective kangaroo?" "Lord, how am I to know, child? Go to sleep." "Will you wake me if the snake comes out?" "Yes." "Go to sleep." Near midnight the children are all asleep, and she sits there still, sewing and reading by turns. From time to time she glances around the floor and wall plate, and whenever she hears a noise she reaches for the stick. The thunderstorm comes on, and the wind, rushing through the cracks in the slab wall, threatens to blow out her candle. She places it on a sheltered part of the dresser and fixes up a newspaper to protect it. At every flash of lightning the cracks between the slabs gleam like polished silver. The thunder rolls and the rain comes down in torrents. Alligator lies at full length on the floor with his eyes turned towards the partition. She knows by this that the snake is there. There are large cracks in that wall opening under the floor of the dwelling house. She is not a coward, but recent events have shaken her nerves. A little son of her brother-in-law was lately bitten by a snake and died. Besides, she has not heard from her husband for 6 months and is anxious about him. He was a drover and started squatting here when they were married. The drought of 18 ruined him. He had to sacrifice the remnants of his flock and go droving again. He intends to move his family into the nearest town when he comes back, and in the meantime his brother, who keeps a shanty on the main road, comes over about once a month with provisions. The wife has still a couple of cows, 1 horse and a few sheep. The brother-in-law kills one of the latter occasionally, gives her what she needs of it, and takes the rest in return for other provisions. She is used to being left alone. She once lived like this for 18 months. As a girl she built the usual castles in the air, but all her girlish hopes and aspirations have long been dead. She finds all the excitement and recreation she needs in the Young Lady's Journal, and, heaven help her, takes a pleasure in the fashion plates. Her husband is an Australian, and so is she. He is careless, but a good enough husband. If he had the means, he would take her to the city and keep her there like a princess. They are used to being apart, or at least she is. "No use fretting," she says. He may forget sometimes that he is married, but if he has a good cheque when he comes back, he will give most of it to her. When he had money, he took her to the city several times, hired a railway sleeping compartment, and put up at the best hotels. He also bought her a buggy, but they had to sacrifice that along with the rest. The last 2 children were born in the bush, one while her husband was bringing a drunken doctor by force to attend to her. She was alone on this occasion and very weak. She had been ill with a fever. She prayed to God to send her assistance. God sent Black Mary, the whitest gin in all the land, or at least God sent King Jimmy first, and he sent Black Mary. He put his black face round the doorpost, took in the situation at a glance, and said cheerfully, "All right, missus, I bring my old woman. She down along the creek." One of the children died while she was here alone. She rode 19 miles for assistance, carrying the dead child. It must be near 1 or 2 o'clock. The fire is burning low. Alligator lies with his head resting on his paws and watches the wall. He is not a very beautiful dog, and the light shows numerous old wounds where the hair will not grow. He is afraid of nothing on the face of the earth or under it. He will tackle a bullock as ready as he will tackle a flea. He hates all other dogs, except kangaroo dogs, and has a marked dislike to friends or relations of the family. They seldom call, however. He sometimes makes friends with strangers. He hates snakes and has killed many, but he will be bitten some day and die. Most snake dogs end that way. Now and then the bushwoman lays down her work and watches and listens and thinks. She thinks of things in her own life, for there is little else to think about. The rain will make the grass grow, and this reminds her of how she fought a bushfire once while her husband was away. The grass was long and very dry, and the fire threatened to burn her out. She put on an old pair of her husband's trousers and beat out the flames with a green bough till great drops of sooty perspiration stood out on her forehead and ran in streaks down her blackened arms. The sight of his mother in trousers greatly amused Tommy, who worked like a little hero by her side. But the terrified baby howled lustily for his mummy. The fire would have mastered her but for 4 excited bushmen who arrived in the nick of time. It was a mixed-up affair all around. When she went to take up the baby, he screamed and struggled convulsively, thinking it was a black man, and Alligator, trusting more to the child's sense than his own instinct, charged furiously and, being old and slightly deaf, did not in his excitement at first recognize his mistress's voice, but continued to hang on to the moleskins until choked off by Tommy with a saddle strap. The dog's sorrow for his blunder and his anxiety to let it be known that it was all a mistake was as evident as his ragged tail and a 12-inch grin could make it. It was a glorious time for the boys, a day to look back to and talk about and laugh over for many years. She thinks how she fought a flood during her husband's absence. She stood for hours in the drenching downpour and dug an overflow gutter to save the dam across the creek, but she could not save it. There are things that a bushwoman cannot do. Next morning the dam was broken, and her heart was nearly broken too, for she thought how her husband would feel when he came home and saw the result of years of labour swept away. She cried then. She also fought the pleuropneumonia, dosed and bled the few remaining cattle, and wept again when her 2 best cows died. Again she fought a mad bullock that besieged the house for a day. She made bullets and fired at him through cracks in the slabs with an old shotgun. He was dead in the morning. She skinned him and got 17 6d for the hide. She also fights the crows and eagles that have designs on her chickens. Her plan of campaign is very original. The children cry, "Crows, mother!" and she rushes out and aims a broomstick at the birds as though it were a gun and says, "Bung!" The crows leave in a hurry. They are cunning, but a woman's cunning is greater. Occasionally a bushman in the horrors or a villainous-looking sundowner comes and nearly scares the life out of her. She generally tells the suspicious-looking stranger that her husband and 2 sons are at work below the dam, or over at the yard, for he always cunningly inquires for the boss. Only last week, a gallows-faced swagman, having satisfied himself that there were no men on the place, threw his swag down on the veranda and demanded tucker. She gave him something to eat. Then he expressed his intention of staying for the night. It was sundown then. She got a baton from the sofa, loosened the dog, and confronted the stranger, holding the baton in one hand and the dog's collar with the other. "Now you go," she said. He looked at her and at the dog, said, "Oh, all right, mum," in a cringing tone, and left. She was a determined-looking woman, and Alligator's yellow eyes glared unpleasantly. Besides, the dog's chewing apparatus greatly resembled that of the reptile he was named after. She has few pleasures to think of as she sits here alone by the fire, on guard against a snake. All days are much the same to her, but on Sunday afternoon she dresses herself, tidies the children, smartens up baby, and goes for a lonely walk along the bush track, pushing an old perambulator in front of her. She does this every Sunday. She takes as much care to make herself and the children look smart as she would if she were going to do the block in the city. There is nothing to see, however, and not a soul to meet. You might walk for 20 miles along this track without being able to fix a point in your mind, unless you are a bushman. This is because of the everlasting, maddening sameness of the stunted trees, that monotony which makes a man long to break away and travel as far as trains can go, and sail as far as ship can sail, and farther. But this bushwoman is used to the loneliness of it. As a girl wife, she hated it, but now she would feel strange away from it. She is glad when her husband returns, but she does not gush or make a fuss about it. She gets him something good to eat and tidies up the children. She seems contented with her lot. She loves her children, but has no time to show it. She seems harsh to them. Her surroundings are not favourable to the development of the womanly or sentimental side of nature. It must be near morning now, but the clock is in the dwelling-house. Her candle is nearly done. She forgot that she was out of candles. Some more wood must be got to keep the fire up, and so she shuts the dog inside and hurries round to the wood heap. The rain has cleared off. She seizes a stick, pulls it out, and crash! The whole pile collapses. Yesterday she bargained with a stray blackfellow to bring her some wood, and while he was at work she went in search of a missing cow. She was absent an hour or so, and the native black made good use of his time. On her return she was so astonished to see a good heap of wood by the chimney that she gave him an extra fig of tobacco and praised him for not being lazy. He thanked her and left with head erect and chest well out. He was the last of his tribe and a king, but he had built that wood heap hollow. She is hurt now, and tears spring to her eyes as she sits down again by the table. She takes up a handkerchief to wipe the tears away, but pokes her eyes with her bare fingers instead. The handkerchief is full of holes, and she finds that she has put her thumb through one and her forefinger through another. This makes her laugh, to the surprise of the dog. He has a keen, very keen sense of the ridiculous, and some time or other she will amuse Bushmen with the story. She had been amused before like that. One day she sat down to have a good cry, as she said, and the old cat rubbed against her dress and cried too. Then she had to laugh. It must be near daylight now. The room is very close and hot because of the fire. Alligator still watches the wall from time to time. Suddenly he becomes greatly interested. He draws himself a few inches nearer the partition, and a thrill runs through his body. The hair on the back of his neck begins to bristle, and the battle light is in his yellow eyes. She knows what this means. and lays her hand on the stick. The lower end of one of the partition slabs has a large crack on both sides. An evil pair of small, bright, bead-like eyes glisten at one of these holes. The snake, a black one, comes slowly out, about a foot, and moves its head up and down. The dog lies still, and the woman sits as one fascinated. The snake comes out a foot farther. She lifts her stick, and the reptile, as though suddenly aware of the danger, sticks his head in through the crack on the other side of the slab and hurries to get his tail round after him. Alligator springs, and his jaws come together with a snap. He misses, for his nose is large, and the snake's body close down in the angle formed by the slabs and the floor. He snaps again as the tail comes round. He has the snake now, and tugs it out 18 inches. Thud, thud, comes the woman's club on the ground. Alligator pulls again. Thud, thud. Alligator gives another pull, and he has the snake out, a black brute, 5 feet long. The head rises to dart about, but the dog has the enemy close to the neck. He is a big, heavy dog, but quick as a terrier. He shakes the snake as though he felt the original curse in common with mankind. The eldest boy wakes up, seizes his stick, and tries to get out of bed, but his mother forces him back with a grip of iron. Thud, thud. The snake's back is broken in several places. Thud, thud. Its head is crushed, and Alligator's nose skinned again. She lifts the mangled reptile on the point of her stick, carries it to the fire and throws it in, then piles on the wood and watches the snake burn. The boy and dog watch too. She lays her hand on the dog's head, and all the fierce, angry light dies out of his yellow eyes. The younger children are quieted and presently go to sleep. The dirty-legged boy stands for a moment in his shirt watching the fire. Presently he looks up at her, sees the tears in her eyes, and, throwing his arms round her neck, exclaims, "Mother, I won't never go drovin', blast me if I do." And she hugs him to her worn-out breast and kisses him, and they sit thus together while the sickly daylight breaks over the bush. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The Fire at Ross's Farm. The squatter saw his pastures wide decrease as one by one the farmers moving to the west selected on his run. Selectors took the water up, and all the black soil round, the best grass land the squatter had, was spoilt by Ross's ground. Now many schemes to shift old Ross had racked the squatter's brains, but Sandy had the stubborn blood of Scotland in his veins. He held the land and fenced it in, he cleared and ploughed the soil, and year by year a richer crop repaid him for his toil. Between the homes for many years the devil left his tracks. The squatter pounded Ross's stock, and Sandy pounded Black's. A well upon the lower run was filled with earth and logs, and Black laid baits about the farm to poison Ross's dogs. It was indeed a deadly feud of class and creed and race, but yet there was a Romeo and a Juliet in the case. And more than once across the flats beneath the Southern Cross, young Robert Black was seen to ride with pretty Jenny Ross. One Christmas time, when months of drought had parched the western creeks, the bushfires started in the north and travelled south for weeks. At night, along the riverside, the scene was grand and strange. The hill fires looked like lighted streets of cities in the range. The cattle tracks between the trees were like long dusky aisles, and on a sudden breeze the fire would sweep along for miles. Light sounds of distant musketry it crackled through the brakes, and o'er the flat of silver grass it hissed like angry snakes. It leapt across the flowing streams and raced o'er pastures broad. It climbed the trees and lit the boughs, and through the scrubs it roared. The bees fell stifled in the smoke, or perished in their hives, and with the stock the kangaroos went flying for their lives. The sun had set on Christmas Eve when through the scrublands wide young Robert Black came riding home as only natives ride. He galloped to the homestead door and gave the first alarm. "The fire is past the granite spur and close to Ross's farm. Now, father, send the men at once, they won't be wanted here. Poor Ross's wheat is all he has to pull him through the year." "Then let it burn," the squatter said. "I'd like to see it done. I'd bless the fire if it would clear selectors from the run." "Go if you will," the squatter said. "You shall not take the men. Go out and join your precious friends, and don't come here again." "I won't come back," young Robert cried, and reckless in his ire, he sharply turned his horse's head and galloped towards the fire. And there, for 3 long weary hours, half blind with smoke and heat, old Ross and Robert fought the flames that neared the ripened wheat. The farmer's hand was nerved by fears of danger and of loss, and Robert fought the stubborn foe for the love of Jenny Ross. But serpent-like the curves and lines slipped past them and between, until they reached the boundary where the old coach road had been. "The track is now our only hope, there we must stand," cried Ross, "for naught on earth can stop the fire if once it gets across." Then came a cruel gust of wind, and with a fiendish rush the flames leapt o'er the narrow path and lit the fence of brush. "The crop must burn," the farmer cried, "we cannot save it now," and down upon the blackened ground he dashed the ragged bough. But wildly, in a rush of hope, his heart began to beat, for o'er the crackling fire he heard the sound of horses' feet. "Here's help at last," young Robert cried, and even as he spoke, the squatter, with a dozen men, came racing through the smoke. Down on the ground the stockmen jumped, and bared each brawny arm. They tore green branches from the trees, and fought for Ross's farm. And when before the gallant band the beaten flames gave way, 2 grimy hands in friendship joined, and it was Christmas Day. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The Union Buries its Dead. While out boating one Sunday afternoon on a billabong across the river, we saw a young man on horseback driving some horses along the bank. He said it was a fine day, and asked if the water was deep there. The joker of our party said it was deep enough to drown him, and he laughed and rode farther up. We didn't take much notice of him. Next day a funeral gathered at a corner pub and asked each other in to have a drink while waiting for the hearse. They passed away some of the time dancing jigs to a piano in the bar parlour. They passed away the rest of the time skylarking and fighting. The defunct was a young Union labourer, about 25, who had been drowned the previous day while trying to swim some horses across a billabong of the Darling. He was almost a stranger in town, and the fact of his having been a Union man accounted for the funeral. The police found some Union papers in his swag and called at the General Labourers' Union office for information about him. That's how we knew. The secretary had very little information to give. The departed was a Roman, and the majority of the town were otherwise. But Unionism is stronger than creed. Liquor, however, is stronger than Unionism, and when the hearse presently arrived, more than 2/3 of the funeral were unable to follow. The procession numbered 15, including the corpse, 14 souls following the broken shell of a soul. Perhaps not one of the 14 possessed a soul any more than the corpse did, but that doesn't matter. 4 or 5 of the funeral who were boarders at the pub borrowed a trap which the landlord used to carry passengers to and from the railway station. They were strangers to us who were on foot, and we to them. We were all strangers to the corpse. A horseman who looked like a drover just returned from a big trip dropped into our dusky wake and followed us a few 100 yards, dragging his pack-horse behind him. But a friend made wild and demonstrative signals from a hotel veranda, hooking at the air in front with his right hand and jobbing his left thumb over his shoulder in the direction of the bar. So the drover hauled off and didn't catch up to us any more. He was a stranger to the entire show. We walked in twos. There were 3 twos. It was very hot and dusty. The heat rushed in fierce, dazzling rays across every iron roof and light-coloured wall that was turned to the sun. 1 or 2 pubs closed respectfully until we got past. They closed their bar doors, and the patrons went in and out through some side or back entrance for a few minutes. Bushmen seldom grumble at an inconvenience of this sort when it is caused by a funeral. They have too much respect for the dead. On the way to the cemetery we passed 3 shearers sitting on the shady side of a fence. One was drunk, very drunk. The other 2 covered their right ears with their hats out of respect for the departed, whoever he might have been, and one of them kicked the drunk and muttered something to him. He straightened himself up, stared, and reached helplessly for his hat, which he shoved half off and then on again. Then he made a great effort to pull himself together, and succeeded. He stood up, braced his back against the fence, knocked off his hat, and remorsefully placed his foot on it to keep it off his head till the funeral passed. A tall sentimental drover who walked by my side cynically quoted Byronic verses suitable to the occasion to death, and asked with pathetic humour whether we thought the dead man's ticket would be recognised over yonder. It was a GLU ticket, and the general opinion was that it would be recognised. Presently my friend said, "You remember when we were in the boat yesterday we saw a man driving some horses along the bank?" "Yes." He nodded at the hearse and said, "Well, that's him." I thought a while. "I didn't take any particular notice of him," I said. "He said something, didn't he?" "Yes, said it was a fine day. You'd have taken more notice if you'd known that he was doomed to die in the hour, and that those were the last words he would say to any man in this world." "To be sure," said a full voice from the rear. "If you'd known that, you'd have prolonged the conversation." We plodded on across the railway line and along the hot dusty road which ran to the cemetery, some of us talking about the accident and lying about the narrow escapes we had had ourselves. Presently someone said, "There's the devil." I looked up and saw a priest standing in the shade of the tree by the tree by the cemetery gate. The hearse was drawn up and the tailboards were opened. The funeral extinguished its right ear with its hat as 4 men lifted the coffin out and laid it over the grave. The priest, a pale, quiet young fellow, stood under the shade of a sapling which grew at the head of the grave. He took off his hat, dropped it carelessly on the ground, and proceeded to business. I noticed that 1 or 2 heathens winced slightly when the holy water was sprinkled on the coffin. The drops quickly evaporated, and the little round black spots they left were soon dusted over, but the spots showed by contrast the cheapness and shabbiness of the cloth with which the coffin was covered. It seemed black before, now it looked a dusky grey. Just here man's ignorance and vanity made a farce of the funeral. A big bull-necked publican with heavy blotchy features and a supremely ignorant expression picked up the priest's straw hat and held it about 2 inches over the head of his reverence during the whole of the service. The father, be it remembered, was standing in the shade. A few shoved their hats on and off uneasily, struggling between their disgust for the living and their respect for the dead. The hat had a conical crown and a brim sloping down all round like a sunshade, and the publican held it with his great red claw spread over the crown. To do the priest justice, perhaps he didn't notice the incident. A stage priest or parson in the same position might have said, "Put the hat down, my friend. Is not the memory of our departed brother worth more than my complexion?" A wattlebark layman might have expressed himself in stronger language, none the less to the point. But my priest seemed unconscious of what was going on. Besides, the publican was a great and important pillar of the church. He couldn't, as an ignorant and conceited ass, lose such a good opportunity of asserting his faithfulness and importance to his church. The grave looked very narrow under the coffin, and I drew a breath of relief when the box slid easily down. I saw a coffin get stuck once at Rookwood, and it had to be yanked out with difficulty and laid on the sods at the feet of the heartbroken relations, who howled dismally while the grave diggers widened the hole. But they don't cut contracts so fine in the West. Our grave digger was not altogether bowelless, and out of respect for that human quality described as feelings, he scraped up some light and dusty soil and threw it down to deaden the fall of the clay lumps on the coffin. He also tried to steer the first few shovelfuls gently down against the end of the grave, with the back of the shovel turned outwards, but the hard, dry Darling River clods rebounded and knocked all the same. It didn't matter much. Nothing does. The fall of lumps of clay on a stranger's coffin doesn't sound any different from the fall of the same things on an ordinary wooden box. At least, I didn't notice anything awesome or unusual in the sound. But perhaps one of us, the most sensitive, might have been impressed by being reminded of a burial of long ago, when the thump of every sod jolted his heart. I have left out the wattle because it wasn't there. I have also neglected to mention the heartbroken old mate, with his grizzled head bowed and great pearly drops streaming down his rugged cheeks. He was absent. He was probably out back. For similar reasons I have omitted reference to the suspicious moisture in the eyes of a bearded bush ruffian named Bill. Bill failed to turn up, and the only moisture was that which was induced by the heat. I have left out the sad Australian sunset because the sun was not going down at the time. The burial took place exactly at midday. The dead bushman's name was Jim, apparently, but they found no portraits, nor locks of hair, nor any love letters, nor anything of that kind in his swag, not even a reference to his mother, only some papers relating to union matters. Most of us didn't know the name till we saw it on the coffin. We knew him as "that poor chap that got drowned yesterday." "So his name's James Tyson," said my drover acquaintance, looking at the plate. "Why, didn't you know that before?" I asked. "No, but I knew he was a union man." It turned out afterwards that J.T. wasn't his real name, only the name he went by. Anyhow, he was buried by it, and most of the great Australian dailies have mentioned in their brevity columns that a young man named James John Tyson was drowned in a billabong of the Darling last Sunday. We did hear later on what his real name was, but if we ever get the chance to read it in the Missing Friends column, we shall not be able to give any information to heartbroken mother or sister or wife, nor to anyone who could let him hear something to his advantage, for we have already forgotten the name. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. A typical bush yarn. They were two chaps named Gory and Blanky. They were tramping from never mind where to some other place. Gory was a bad egg, and Blanky knew it, but they'd fallen in with each other on the track and agreed to travel together for the sake of company. Blanky had £25, which fact was known to Gory, who was stumped. Every night Gory tried to get the money, which fact was known to Blanky, who never slept with more than one eye shut. When their tracks divided, Gory said to Blanky, "Oh, look here, where the deuce do you keep that stuff of yours? I've been trying to get hold of it every night when you was asleep." "I know you have," said Blanky. "Well, where the blazes did you put it?" "Under your head." "The you did." They grinned, shook hands, and parted, and Gory scratched his head very hard and very often as he tramped along the track. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. The Bush Undertaker. 5 bob! The old man shaded his eyes and peered through the dazzling glow of that broiling Christmas day. He stood just within the door of a slab and bark hut situated upon the bank of a barren creek. Sheep yards lay to the right, and a low line of bare brown ridges formed a suitable background to the scene. 5 bob! Shouted he again, and a dusty sheepdog rose wearily from the shaded side of the hut and looked inquiringly at his master, who pointed towards some sheep which were straggling from the flock. "Fetch 'em back," he said confidently. The dog went off, and his master returned to the interior of the hut. "We'll yard 'em early," he said to himself. "The super won't know. We'll yard 'em early, and have the afternoon to ourselves. We'll get dinner," he added, glancing at some pots on the fire. "I could do a bit of doughboy, and that there boggerbrie'll eat like marrow along of the salt meat." He moved one of the black buckets from the blaze. "I likes to keep it just on the sizzle," he said in explanation to himself. "Hard boilin' makes it tough. I'll keep it just a simmerin'." Here his soliloquy was interrupted by the return of the dog. "All right, 5 bob," said the hatter. "Dinner'll be ready directly. Just keep your eye on the sheep till I calls you. Keep 'em well rounded up, and we'll yard 'em afterwards and have a holiday." This speech was accompanied by a gesture evidently intelligible, for the dog retired as though he understood English, and the cooking proceeded. "I'll take a pick and shovel with me and root up that old black fellow," mused the shepherd, evidently following up a recent train of thought. "I reckon it'll do now. I'll put in the spuds." The last sentence referred to the cooking, the first to a black fellow's grave, about which he was curious. "The sheep's a campin'," said the soliloquizer, glancing through the door, "so me and 5 bob'll be able to get our dinner in peace. I wish I had just enough fat to make the pan sis. I'd treat myself to a leather jacket, but it took 3 weeks skimming to get enough for them there doughboys." In due time the dinner was dished up, and the old man seated himself on a block, with the lid of a gin case across his knees for a table. 5 bob squatted opposite with the liveliest interest and appreciation depicted on his intelligent countenance. Dinner proceeded very quietly, except when the carver paused to ask the dog how some tasty morsel went with him, and 5 bob's tail declared that it went very well indeed. "Here you are, try this," cried the old man, tossing him a large piece of doughboy. A click of 5 bob's jaws, and the dough was gone. "Clean into his liver," said the old man with a faint smile. He washed up the tinware in the water the duff had been boiled in, and then, with the assistance of the dog, yarded the sheep. This accomplished, he took a pick and shovel and an old sack and started out over the ridge, followed, of course, by his 4-legged mate. After tramping some 3 miles, he reached a spur running out from the main ridge. At the extreme end of this, under some gum trees, was a little mound of earth, barely defined in the grass, and indented in the centre, as all blackfellows' graves were. He set to work to dig it up, and sure enough, in about half an hour, he bottomed on payable dirt. When he had raked up all the bones, he amused himself by putting them together on the grass and by speculating as to whether they had belonged to black or white, male or female. Failing, however, to arrive at any satisfactory conclusion, he dusted them with great care, put them in the bag, and started for home. He took a short cut this time over the ridge and down a gully which was full of ring-barked trees and long white grass. He had nearly reached its mouth when a great greasy black goanna clambered up a sapling from under his feet and looked fightable. "Dang the jumped-up thing!" cried the old man. "It gi'n me a start." At the foot of the sapling he espied an object which he at first thought was the blackened carcass of a sheep, but on closer examination discovered to be the body of a man. It lay with its forehead resting on its hands, dried to a mummy by the intense heat of the western summer. "Me luck's in for the day, and no mistake," said the shepherd, scratching the back of his head while he took stock of the remains. He picked up a stick and tapped the body on the shoulder. The flesh sounded like leather. He turned it over on its side. It fell flat on its back like a board, and the shriveled eyes seemed to peer up at him from under the blackened wrists. He stepped back involuntarily, but recovering himself, leant on his stick and took in all the ghastly details. There was nothing in the blackened features to tell aught of name or race, but the dress proclaimed the remains to be those of a European. The old man caught sight of a black bottle in the grass, close beside the corpse. This set him thinking. Presently he knelt down and examined the soles of the dead man's blucher boots, and then, rising with an air of conviction, exclaimed, "Brummy, by gosh! Busted up at last! I told you so, Brummy," he said impressively, addressing the corpse. "I allus told you as how it 'ud be, and here you are, you thunderin' jumped-up cuss-o'-God fool. You could earn more'n many men in the colony, but you'd lush it all away. I allus said as how it'd end up, and now you can see for yourself. I s'pect you was comin' to me to get fixed up and set straight again. Then you was a-goin' to swear off, same as you allus did, and here you are, and now I expect I'll have to fix you up for the last time and make you decent, for 'twon't do leaving you a-lying out here like a dead sheep." He picked up the corked bottle and examined it. To his great surprise it was nearly full of rum. "Well, this gets me!" exclaimed the old man. "Me luck's in, this Christmas, and no mistake. He must have got the jams early in his spree, or he wouldn't be a-making for me with near a bottleful left. Howsomever, here goes." Looking around, his eyes lit up with satisfaction as he saw some bits of bark which had been left by a party of strippers who had been getting bark there for the stations. He picked up 2 pieces, one about 4 and the other 6 feet long, and each about 2 feet wide, and brought them over to the body. He laid the longest strip by the side of the corpse, which he proceeded to lift on to it. "Come on, Brummy," he said in a softer tone than usual. "You ain't as bad as you might be, considering as it must be 3 good months since you slipped your wind. I s'pect it was the rum as preserved you. It was the death of you when you was alive, and now you're dead it preserves you, like a mummy." Then he placed the other strip on top with the hollow side downwards, thus sandwiching the defunct between the 2 pieces, removed the saddle strap which he wore for a belt, and buckled it round one end, while he tried to think of something with which to tie up the other. "I can't take any more strips off my shirt," he said, critically examining the skirts of the old blue overshirt he wore. "I might get a strip or 2 more off, but it's short enough already. Let's see, how long have I been a-wearing of that shirt? Oh, I remember. I bought it just 2 days afore 5 bob was pupped. I can't afford a new shirt just yet. Howsomever, seeing it's Brummy, I'll just borrow a couple more strips, and sew 'em on again when I get home." He upended Brummy, and placing his shoulder against the middle of the lower sheet of bark, lifted the corpse to a horizontal position, then, taking the bag of bones in his hand, he started for home. "I ain't spending such a dull Christmas after all," he reflected as he plodded on. But he had not walked above 100 yards when he saw a black goanna sidling into the grass. "That's another of them there dang things," he said. "That's two I've seed this morning." Presently he remarked, "You don't smell none too sweet, Brummy. It must have been just about the middle of shearing when you pegged out. I wonder who got your last cheque. Shoo! There's another black goanna. There must be a flock of them." He rested Brummy on the ground while he had another pull at the bottle, and, before going on, packed the bag of bones on his shoulder under the body, and he soon stopped again. "The thunderin' jumped up bones is all skew whiffed," he said. "Hole on, Brummy, and I'll fix 'em." And he leaned the dead man against a tree while he settled the bones on his shoulder and took another pull at the bottle. About a mile further on he heard a rustling in the grass to the right, and, looking round, saw another goanna gliding off sideways with its long snaky neck turned towards him. This puzzled the shepherd considerably, the strangest part of it being that 5 Bob wouldn't touch the reptile, but slunk off with his tail down when ordered to "sick 'em." "There's something comic about them there goannas," said the old man at last. "I've seed swarms of grasshoppers and big mobs of kangaroos, but dang me if I ever seed a flock of black goannas afore." On reaching the hut the old man dumped the corpse against the wall, wrong end up, and stood scratching his head while he endeavoured to collect his muddled thoughts. But he had not placed Brummy at the correct angle, and consequently that individual fell forward and struck him a violent blow on the shoulder with the iron toes of his blucher boots. The shock sobered him. He sprang a good yard, instinctively hitching up his moleskins in preparation for flight, but a backward glance revealed to him the true cause of this supposed attack from the rear. Then he lifted the body, stood it on its feet against the chimney, and ruminated as to where he should lodge his mate for the night, not noticing that the shorter sheet of bark had slipped down on the boots and left the face exposed. "I expect I'll have to put you into the chimney trough for the night, Brummy," said he, turning round to confront the corpse. "You can't expect me to take you into the hut, though I did it when you was in a worse state than Lord!" The shepherd was not prepared for the awful scrutiny that gleamed on him from those empty sockets. His nerves received a shock, and it was some time before he recovered himself sufficiently to speak. "Now look here, Brummy," said he, shaking his finger severely at the delinquent. "I don't want to pick a row with you. I'd do as much for you and more than any other man, and well you knows it. But if you starts playing any of your jumped-up practical jokes on me, and a scaring of me after the humping of your home, by the holy frost I'll kick you to Jim Rags, so I will." This admonition delivered, he hoisted Brummy into the chimney trough, and with a last glance towards the sheep yards, he retired to his bunk to have, as he said, a snooze. He had more than a snooze, however, for when he woke it was dark, and the bushman's instinct told him it must be nearly 9 o'clock. He lit a slush lamp and poured the remainder of the rum into a pannikin, but just as he was about to lift the draught to his lips, he heard a peculiar rustling sound overhead, and put the pot down on the table with a slam that spilled some of the precious liquor. 5 Bob whimpered, and the old shepherd, though used to the weird and dismal, as one living alone in the bush must necessarily be, felt the icy breath of fear at his heart. He reached hastily for his old shotgun and went out to investigate. He walked round the hut several times and examined the roof on all sides, but saw nothing. Brummy appeared to be in the same position. At last, persuading himself that the noise was caused by possums or the wind, the old man went inside, boiled his billy, and after composing his nerves somewhat with a light supper and a meditative smoke, retired for the night. He was aroused several times before midnight by the same mysterious sound overhead, but though he rose and examined the roof on each occasion by the light of the rising moon, he discovered nothing. At last he determined to sit up and watch until daybreak, and for this purpose took up a position on a log a short distance from the hut, with his gun laid in readiness across his knee. After watching for about an hour, he saw a black object coming over the ridgepole. He grabbed his gun and fired. The thing disappeared. He ran round to the other side of the hut, and there was a great black goanna in violent convulsions on the ground. Then the old man saw it all. "The thundering jumped-up thing has been a-having of me," he says. "The same cuss-o'-god wretch as followed me home and has been having its Christmas dinner off a brummie and a-haunting me into the bargain. The jumped-up tinker!" As there was no one by whom he could send a message to the station, and the old man dared not leave the sheep and go himself, he determined to bury the body the next afternoon, reflecting that the authorities could disinter it for inquest, if they pleased. So he brought the sheep home early and made the arrangements for the burial by measuring the outer casing of Brummie and digging a hole according to those dimensions. "That minds me," he said, "I never rightly knowed Brummie's religion, blest if I ever did. Howsomenever, there's one thing sartin, none of them there piano-fingered parsons is a-going to take the trouble for travel out into this God-forgotten part to hold sarvice over him, seeing as how his last cheque's blued. But as I've got the funeral arrangements all in my own hands, I'll do justice to it and see that Brummie has a good comfortable burying, and more's unpossible. It's time you turned in, Brum," he said, lifting the body down. He carried it to the grave and dropped it in one corner like a post. He arranged the bark so as to cover the face, and by means of a piece of clothesline lowered the body to a horizontal position. Then he threw in an armful of gum leaves, and then, very reluctantly, took the shovel and dropped in a few shovels of earth. "And this is the last of Brummie," he said, leaning on his spade and looking away over the tops of the ragged gums on the distant range. This reflection seemed to engender a flood of memories in which the old man became absorbed. He leaned heavily upon his spade and thought. "Arter all," he murmured sadly, "arter all, it were Brummie. Brummie," he said at last, "it's all over now. Nothing matters now. Nothing didn't ever matter, nor don't. You used to say as how it'd be all right tomorrow. Tomorrow's come, Brummie, come for you. It ain't come for me yet, but it's a-comin'." He threw in some more earth. "You don't remember, Brummie, and maybe you don't want to remember. I don't want to remember, but you see, that's where you got the pull on me." He shovelled in some more earth and paused again. The dog rose with ears erect and looked anxiously first at his master and then into the grave. "There ought to be something said," muttered the old man. "'Tain't right to put him under like a dog. There ought to be some sort of sermon." He sighed heavily in the listening silence that followed this remark and proceeded with his work. He filled the grave to the brim this time and fashioned the mound carefully with his spade. Once or twice he muttered the words, "I am the resurrection." As he laid the tools quietly aside and stood at the head of the grave, he was evidently trying to remember the something that ought to be said. He removed his hat, placed it carefully on the grass, held his hands out from his sides and a little to the front, drew a long deep breath, and said with a solemnity that greatly disturbed Five Bob, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, Brummie, and in hopes of a great and glorious resurrection." He sat down on a log near by, rested his elbows on his knees, and passed his hand wearily over his forehead, but only as one who was tired and felt the heat, and presently he rose, took up the tools, and walked back to the hut. And the sun sank again on the grand Australian bush, the nurse and tutor of eccentric minds, the home of the weird. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Legend of Coo-ee Gully. The night came down through Deadman's Gap, where the ghostly saplings bent before a wind that tore the fly from many a digger's tent. Dark as pitch, and the rain rushed past on a wind that howled again, and we crowded into the only hut that stood on the hillside then. The strong pine rafters creaked and strained till we thought that the roof would go, and we felt the box-bark walls bend in and bulge like calico. A flood had come from the gorges round, through the gully's bed it poured, down many a deep deserted shaft the yellow waters roared. The scene leapt out when the lightning flashed and shone with a ghastly grey, and the night sprang back to the distant range, 'neath a sky as bright as day. Then the darkness closed like a trap that was sprung, and the night grew black as coals, and we heard the ceaseless thunder of the water down the holes. And now and then, like a cannon's note that sounds in the battle din, we heard the louder thunder spring from a shaft when the sides fell in. We had gathered close to the broad hut fire to yarn of the bygone years, when a Coo-ee that came from the flooded grounds fell sharp on our startled ears. We sprang to our feet, for well we knew that in speed lay the only hope. One caught and over his shoulder threw a coil of yellow rope. Then, blinded oft by the lightning's flash, down the steep hillsides we sped, and at times we slipped on the sodden path that ran to the gully's bed. And on past many a broken shaft, all reckless of risk we ran, for the wind still brought in spiteful gusts the cry of the drowning man. But the cooeying ceased when we reached the place, and there, ere a man could think, we heard the treacherous earth give way and fall from a shaft's black brink. And deep and wide the rotten side slipped into the hungry hole, and the phosphorus leapt and vanished like the flight of the stranger's soul. And still in the sound of the rushing rain, when the night comes dark and drear, from the pitch-black side of that gully wide, the Coo-ee you'll hear and hear. Coo-ee, Coo-ee, low and eerily it whispers afar and drear, and then to the heart, like an icy dart, it strikes through the startled ear. Dreader than wrung from the human tongue, it shrieks o'er the sound of the rain, and back on the hill when the wind is still, it whispers and dies again. And on through the night, like the voice of a sprite that tells of a dire mishap, it echoes around in the gully's bound and out through Deadman's Gap. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, Macquarie's Mate. The chaps in the bar of Stiffness Shanty were talking about Macquarie, an absent shearer, who seemed, from their conversation, to be better known than liked by them. "I ain't seen Macquarie for ever so long," remarked Box of Tricks after a pause. "Wonder where he could have got to." "Jail, p'raps, or hell," growled Barcoo. "He ain't much loss any road." "My oath, you're right, Barcoo," interposed Sally Thompson. "But now I come to think of it, old Awful Example there was a mate of his one time. Blest if the old soaker ain't coming to life again." A shaky rag and dirt covered framework of a big man rose uncertainly from a corner of the room and, staggering forward, brushed the staring thatch back from his forehead with one hand, reached blindly for the edge of the bar with the other, and drooped heavily. "Well, Awful Example," demanded the shanty keeper, "what's up with you now?" The drunkard lifted his head and glared wildly around with bloodshot eyes. Don't you talk about him! Drop it, I say, drop it!" "What's the devil's the matter with you now, anyway?" growled the barman. "Got him again, hey?" Don't you talk about Macquarie. He's a mate of mine. Here, give me a drink." "Well, what if he is a mate of yours?" sneered Barcoo. "It don't reflect much credit on you, nor him neither." The logic contained in the last three words was unanswerable, and Awful Example was still fairly reasonable, even when rum oozed out of him at every pore. He gripped the edge of the bar with both hands, let his ruined head fall forward until it was on a level with his temporarily rigid arms, and stared blindly at the dirty floor. Then he straightened himself up, still keeping his hold on the bar. "Some of you chaps," he said huskily, "one of you chaps in this bar today called Macquarie a scoundrel and a loafer and a blackguard and a sneak and a liar." "Well, what if we did?" said Barcoo defiantly. "He's all that and a cheat into the bargain. And now what are you going to do about it?" The old man swung sideways to the bar, rested his elbow on it and his head on his hand. "Macquarie wasn't a sneak and he wasn't a liar," he said in a quiet, tired tone. "And Macquarie wasn't a cheat." "Well, old man, you needn't get your rag out about it," said Sally Thompson soothingly. "Perhaps we was a bit too hard on him, and it isn't altogether right, chaps, considering he's not here. But then, you know, awful, he might have acted straight to you, that was his mate. The meanest blank, if he is a man at all, will do that." "Oh, to blazes with the old sot," shouted Barcoo. "I gave my opinion about Macquarie, and what's more, I'll stand to it." I've got a point for the defence," the old man went on without heeding the interruptions. "I've got a point or two for the defence." "Well, let's have it," said Stiffner. In the first place, Macquarie never talked about no man behind his back." There was an uneasy movement and a painful silence. Barcoo reached for his drink and drank slowly. He needed time to think. Boxer Tricks studied his boots. Sally Thompson looked out at the weather. The shanty keeper wiped the top of the bar very hard. And the rest shifted round and "s'posed they'd try a game of cards." Barcoo set his glass down very softly, pocketed his hands deeply and defiantly, and said, "Well, what of that? Macquarie was as strong as a bull, and the greatest bully on the river into the bargain. He could call a man a liar to his face and smash his face afterwards, and he did it often too, and with smaller men than himself." There was a breath of relief in the bar. "Do you want to make out that I'm talking about a man behind his back?" continued Barcoo threateningly, to awful example. "You'd best take care, old man." "Macquarie wasn't a coward," remonstrated the drunkard softly, but in an injured tone. "What's up with you anyway?" yelled the publican. "What you growling at? Do you want a row? Get out if you can't be agreeable." The boozer swung his back to the bar, hooked himself on by his elbows, and looked vacantly out the door. "I've got another point for the defence," he muttered. It's always best to keep the last point to the last." "Oh, Lord. Well, out with it. Out with it." "Macquarie's dead. That's what it is." Everyone moved uneasily. Sally Thompson turned the other side to the bar, crossed one leg behind the other, and looked down over his hip at the sole and heel of his elastic side. The barman rinsed the glasses vigorously. Longbones shuffled and dealt on the top of a cask, and some of the others gathered round him and got interested. Barcoo thought he heard his horse breaking away, and went out to see to it, followed by Boxer Tricks and a couple more who thought that it might be one of their horses. Someone, a tall, gaunt, determined-looking bushman with square features and haggard grey eyes, had ridden in unnoticed through the scrub to the back of the shanty and dismounted by the window. When Barcoo and the others re-entered the bar, it soon became evident that Sally Thompson had been thinking, for presently he came to the general rescue as follows. "There's a blessed lot of tommy-rot about dead people in this world, a lot of damned old woman nonsense. There's more sympathy wasted over dead and rotten skunks than there is injustice done to straight, honest living chaps. I don't believe in this gory sentiment about the dead at the expense of the living. I believe in justice for the living, and the dead too for that matter. But justice for the living. Macquarie was a bad egg, and it don't alter the case if he was dead 1,000 times." There was another breath of relief in the bar, and presently someone said, "You're tight, Sally." "Good for you, Sally, old man. cried Box of Tricks, taking it up. "And besides, I don't believe Macquarie is dead at all. He's always dying or being reported dead and then turning up again. Where did you hear about it, Awful?" The example ruefully rubbed a corner of his roof with the palm of his hand. There's a lot in what you say, Sally Thompson," he admitted slowly, totally ignoring Box of Tricks. But, oh, we've had enough of the old fool," yelled Barco. "Macquarie was a spieler, and any man that'd be his mate ain't much better." "Here, take a drink and dry up, your old hass," said the man behind the bar, pushing a bottle and glass towards the drunkard. "Do you want a row?" The old man took the bottle and glass in his shaking hands and painfully poured out a drink. "There's a lot in what Sally Thompson says," he went on obstinately, but, he added in a strained tone, "there's another point that I near forgot, and none of you seem to think of it, not even Sally Thompson nor Box of Tricks there." Stiffner turned his back, and Barcoo spat viciously and impatiently. "Yes," drivelled the drunkard, "I've got another point for the defence of my mate Macquarie." "Oh, out with it! Spit it out, for God's sake, or you'll bust!" roared Stiffner. "What the blazes is it?" "His mate's alive!" yelled the old man. "Macquarie's mate's alive, that's what it is!" He reeled back from the bar, dashed his glass and hat to the boards, gave his pants a hitch by the waistband that almost lifted him off his feet, and tore at his shirt sleeves. "Make a ring, boys!" he shouted. "His mate's alive! Put up your hands, Barcoo! By God, his mate's alive!" Someone had turned his horse loose at the rear, and had been standing by the back door for the last 5 minutes. Now he slipped quietly in. "Keep the old fool off, or he'll get hurt," snarled Barcoo. Stiffner jumped the counter. There were loud, hurried words of remonstrance, then some stump-splitting oaths, and a scuffle, consequent upon an attempt to chuck the old man out. Then a crash. Stiffner and Box of Tricks were down, 2 others were holding Barcoo back, and someone had pinned Awful Example by the shoulders from behind. "Let me go!" he yelled, too blind with passion to notice the movements of surprise among the men before him. "Let me go!" he yelled, too blind with passion to notice the movements of surprise among the men before him. "Let me go! I'll smash any man that says a word again a mate of mine behind his back. Barcoo, I'll have your blood. Let me go. I'll... Who's holding me? You... "It's Macquarie, old mate," said a quiet voice. Barcoo thought he heard his horse again, and went out in a hurry. Perhaps he thought that the horse would get impatient and break loose if he left it any longer, for he jumped into the saddle and rode off. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. When the Children Come Home. On a lonely selection, far out in the west, an old woman works all the day without rest, and she croons as she toils 'neath the sky's glazed dome, "Sure I'll keep the old place till the children come home." She mends all the fences, she grubs and she ploughs, she drives the old horse and she milks all the cows, and she sings to herself as she thatches the stack, "Sure I'll keep the old place till the children come home." It is 5 weary years since her old husband died, and oft as he lay on his deathbed he said, "Sure one man can bring up 10 children, he can, and it's sad that 10 some cannot keep one old man." Whenever the scowling old sundowners come and cunningly ask if the master's at home, "Be off," she replies, "with your Barney and cant, or I'll call my son Andy, he's working beyant." "Get out," she replies, though she trembles with fear, for she lives all alone and no neighbours are near. But she says to herself, when she's like to despond, that the boys are at work in the paddock beyond. Ah, none of her children need follow the plough, and some have grown rich in the city ere now. Yet she says They might come when the shearing is done, and I'll keep the old place, if it's only for one. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Mystery of Dave Regan. And then there was Dave Regan, said the traveller. Dave used to die oftener than any other bushman I knew. He was always being reported dead and turning up again. He seemed to like it, except once, when his brother drew his money and drank it all to drown his grief at what he called Dave's untimely end. Well, Dave went up to Queensland once with cattle, and was away 3 years and reported dead, as usual. He was drowned in the Bogan this time while trying to swim his horse across the flood, and his sweetheart hurried up and got spliced to a worse man before Dave got back. Well, one day I was out in the bush looking for timber when the biggest storm ever knowed in that place come on. There was hail in it too, as big as bullets, and if I hadn't got behind a stump and crouched down in time, I'd have been riddled like a bushranger. As it was, I got soaking wet. The storm was over in a few minutes, the water run off down the gullies, and the sun come out, and the scrub steamed and stunk like a new pair of moleskin trousers. I went on along the track, and presently I seen a long lanky chap get onto a long lanky horse and ride out of a bush yard at the end of a clearing. I knowed it was Dave directly I set eyes on him. Dave used to ride a tall holler-backed thoroughbred with a body and limbs like a kangaroo dog, and it would circle around you and sidle away as if it was frightened you was going to jab a knife into it. "Hello, Dave," said I as he came spurring up. "How are you?" "Hello, Jim," says he. "How are you?" "All right," says I. "How are you getting on?" But before he could say any more, that horse shied away and broke off through the scrub to the right. I waited, because I knowed Dave would come back again if I waited long enough, and in about 10 minutes he came sidling in from the scrub to the left. "Oh, I'm all right," says he, spurring up sideways. "How are you?" "Right," says I. "How's the old people?" "Oh, I ain't been home yet," says he, holding out his hand, but afore I could grip it, the cussed horse sidled off to the south end of the clearing and broke away again through the scrub. I heard Dave swearing about the country for 20 minutes or so, and then he came spurling and cursing in from the other end of the clearing. "Where have you been all this time?" I said, as the horse came curving up like a boomerang. "Gulf country," said Dave. "That was a storm, Dave," said I. "My oath," says Dave. "Get caught in it?" "Yes." "Got to shelter?" "No." "But you're dry as a bone, Dave." Dave grinned. He yelled. He said that to the horse as it boomeranged off again and broke away through the scrub. I waited, but he didn't come back, and I reckoned he'd got so far away before he could pull up that he didn't think it worth while coming back, so I went on. By and by I got thinking. Dave was as dry as a bone, and I knowed that he hadn't had time to get to shelter, for there wasn't a shed within 12 miles. He wasn't only dry, but his coat was creased and dusty too, same as if he'd been sleeping in a hollow log, and when I come to think of it, his face seemed thinner and whiter than it used to, and so did his hands and wrists, which always stuck a long way out of his coat sleeves, and there was blood on his face, but I thought he'd got scratched with a twig. Dave used to wear a coat 3 or 4 sizes too small for him, with sleeves that didn't come much below his elbows, and a tail that scarcely reached his waist behind, and his hair seemed dark and lank instead of being sandy and sticking out like an old fibre brush, as it used to. And then I thought his voice sounded different too, and when I inquired next day, there was no one heard of Dave, and the chaps reckoned I must have been drunk or seen his ghost. It didn't seem all right at all, and it worried me a lot. I couldn't make out how Dave kept dry, and the horse and saddlecloth was wet. I told the chaps how he talked to me and what he said, and how he swore at the horse, but they only said it was Dave's ghost and nobody else's. I told them about him being dry as a bone after getting caught in that storm, but they only laughed and said it was a dry place where Dave went to. I talked and argued about it until the chaps began to tap their foreheads and wink. Then I left off talking. But I didn't leave off thinking. I always hated a mystery. Even Dave's father told me that Dave couldn't be alive or else his ghost wouldn't be round. He said he knew Dave better than that. One or two fellows did turn up afterwards that had seen Dave about the time that I did, and then the chaps said they were sure that Dave was dead. But one fine day, as a lot of us chaps were playing pitch and toss at the shanty, one of the fellows yelled out, "By gee, here comes Dave Regan!" And I looked up and saw Dave himself sidling out of a cloud of dust on a long, lanky horse. He rode into the stockyard, got down, hung his horse up to a post, put up the rails, and then come sloping towards us with a half-acre grin on his face. Dave had long, thin bow legs, and when he was on the ground he moved as if he was on roller skates. "Hello, Dave," says I. "How are you?" "Hello, Jim," said he. "How the blazes are you?" "All right," says I, shaking hands. "How are you?" "Oh, I'm all right," he says. "How are you popping up?" Well, when we got all that settled and the other chaps had asked how he was, he said, well, let's have a drink." And all the other chaps crawfished up and flung themselves round the corner and sidled into the bar after Dave. We had a lot of talk, and he told us that he'd been down before, but had gone away without seeing any of us, except me, because he'd suddenly heard of a mob of cattle at a station 200 miles away. And after a while I took him aside and said, "Look here, Dave, do you remember the day I met you after the storm?" He scratched his head. "Why, yes," he says. "Did you get under shelter that day?" "Why, no." "Then how the blazes didn't you get wet?" Dave grinned, then he says, "Why, when I seen the storm coming up I took off me clothes and stuck 'em in a hollow rock till the rain was over." "Yes," he says, after the other coves had done laughing, "but before I'd done thinking I kept my clothes dry and got a good refreshing shower bath into the bargain." Then he scratched the back of his neck with his little finger and dropped his jaw and thought a bit. Then he rubbed the top of his head and his shoulder, reflective-like, and then he said, "But I didn't reckon for them blanky hailstones." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. A Derry on a Cove. 'Twas in the felon's dock he stood, his eyes were black and blue, his voice with grief was broken, and his nose was broken too. He muttered as that broken nose he wiped upon his cap, "It's awful when the police has got a derry on a chap." I am an honest working cove, as any bloke can see. It's just because the police has got a derry, sir, on me. Oh yes, the legal gents can grin, I say it ain't no joke. It's cruel when the police has got a derry on a bloke. "Why don't you go to work?" he said. He muttered, "Why don't you? Your honour knows as well as me there ain't no work to do, and when I try to find a job I'm shadowed by a trap. It's awful when the police has got a derry on a chap." I sighed and shed a tearlet for that noble nature marred, but the bench was trough on him and gave him 6 months hard. He only said, "Beyond the grave you'll cop it hot, by Jove. There ain't no angel police to get a derry on a cove." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Short Stories in Prose and Verse by Henry Lawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Trouble on the Selection. "You lazy boy, you're here at last. You must be wooden-legged. Now, are you sure the gate is fast and all the slip-rails pegged, and all the milkers at the yard, the calves all in the pen? We don't want Foley's calf to suck his mother dry again. And did you mend the broken rail and make it firm and neat? I suppose you want that brindle steer all night among the wheat. And if he finds the lucerne patch, he'll stuff his belly full. He'll eat till he gets blown on that, and busts like Ryan's bull. Old Spot is lost. You'll drive me mad, you will, upon my soul. She might be in the boggy swamps, or down a digger's hole. You needn't talk, you never looked. You'll find her if you choose, instead of poking possum logs and hunting kangaroos. How came your boots as wet as muck? You tried to drown the ants? Why don't you take your bluchers off? Good Lord, he's tore his pants. Your father's coming home tonight. You'll catch it hot, you'll see. Now, go and wash your filthy face and come and get your tea. End of chapter 16. End of short stories in prose and verse by Henry Lawson.